Good evening. I get to do the introduction tonight, and it's actually a great honor for me to be able to introduce two people who have made my life, and I think many of our lives here in Los Angeles, a lot more interesting, challenging, and enjoyable. I'd like to introduce Christian and Sylvia with a question, which is, what are the languages of architecture? After all, architecture is about building. It is not building itself. It is a form of communication about building. It's that which tells us about the structures and cities we inhabit and allows us to represent our socialized spaces. How do we describe buildings? How do we represent the making of spaces? What are the codes and conventions that allow us to build, to project, to plan, to construct, to use buildings, in fact? What is the proper way for buildings to be? What is the ethics of architecture? What are appropriate structures? For both Sylvia and Christian, these questions have been at the heart of their practice. I say practice because traditional notions of the architect as a builder have turned out to be just that, the result of a tradition, conventions in our society. As we engage in the continual archaeology of theory and practice of architecture, rebuilding our world through interpretations of sites and codes, we keep coming across the fragments and clues that reconstruct our very understanding of our environment. For Sylvia, this process has been a historical one, as well as a critical one. She's trained as an art historian at Barnard in Columbia. She has an MA, an MPhil, and a PhD. And she started first working on modern architecture and then digging into its roots. She started looking at the very birthplace of modern architecture, namely at that point when its rules were indeed codified, mainly under the direction of Quatremère de Quincy. And out of this work came her dissertation, which was published last year by the MIT Press, Quatremère de Quincy and the Invention of a Modern Language of Architecture, which has helped us reinterpret modern architecture in terms of the very language we use to describe and interpret it. For Christian, it has been a journey across various activities and structures of interpretation, not to mention cultures. Belgian-born and trained as an architect at the GSD at Harvard, he became a fellow at the now legendary Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies, where he helped to translate some of the texts that have become seminal in our reinterpretation of the roles and codes of architects. He then also became a practicing architect, working first in New York and since 1986 in Los Angeles, engaging in work that questions the materiality of its subject, whether buildings or text, rather than imposing an outside order on them. Since moving to Los Angeles, he has extended his inquiry further by bringing together architects and critics and interested laypeople in the LA Forum, which he helped found, and has widened his research into the codes and structures of biology, physics, mathematics, and the various other structures by which we can start to understand the space-time continuum. Together, Sylvia and Christian have been engaging students here in their research through a series of classes. They will continue this questioning through tonight's effort, which they have dubbed the double bill, and ask that you keep your questions for the less codified environment of the reception after the lecture. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Christian Hubert and Sylvia Lavin.
Thank you, Aaron. Can you hear me all right? Well, various people asked us if we were going to do a Cheech and Chong routine, or how exactly we were going to structure our lecture. And the fact is that we're basically giving two separate lectures. I think that I'm going first primarily because, perhaps contrary to what you might expect, my lecture is more historical and Sylvia's is more contemporary. I know that this series was called Future Projections, and it wasn't just out of contrary impulses that I'll be speaking mostly about the past. I'd like to show you one project of mine, which is now 10 years old, and take you through a brief excursion through some earlier moments in the 20th century and return to the present with a few questions in mind. I have the first slide, please. No, only the one on the left. Okay, thank you. This project called Hubert, or Hubert, I've never been quite sure how to pronounce it, was prepared for an exhibition at the Leo Castelli Gallery in New York and the James Corcoran Gallery in Los Angeles called Follies, Architecture for the Late 20th Century Landscape in 1983. It's almost exactly 10 years old. Some things have changed a lot since then, others have not. Let me read you the text that I prepared to accompany the piece. This project has no physical object as its goal, only a series of images and the simulation of a spatial narrative which unfolds on a computer-activated video screen. In a first moment, the path of folly leads into the heroic and ordered landscape of Poussin. The effects of perspective and animation create the illusion of traveling through the painted space, which turns out to contain a number of artifacts from the 20th century, preserved in the anticipation of their ruin. Soon the space begins to flatten into ambiguous and partial perspectives, and the individual pixels of color begin to take on autonomous identities, much as the dots and dabs of Cézanne's paintings. Later on, the grid becomes more and more dominant, forcing the viewer to choose between conflicting axonometric interpretations. It becomes increasingly difficult to decide whether one is being confronted with projecting objects or receding spaces, and Hubert reacts to block the viewer's path. An occasional monument, temple, pyramid, or even grotto appears, but bit by bit, or rather bite by bite, the space is transformed into the weightless world of El Lissitzky until finally the screen becomes blank except for an aleatory set of color changes. The sketches and stills on display illustrate moments in the unfolding of the folly. In its fully realized form, the images would appear on a monitor and the movement would be controlled by a joystick, much like many video arcade games. In order to exit from the folly, however, the viewer would be required to leave a memento in the machine. This would be drawn with a cursor and would reappear in subsequent trajectories. Now, the caption at the bottom, I'm not sure if you can read it, but I'll assume you can, may not seem so provocative or even accurate today. It is a quote from an essay by Hayden White, professor of the history of consciousness at the UC of Santa Cruz. And in his study of historical writing as narrative form, Hayden White traced the means by which historical discourse, and I quote here, makes the real into an object of desire, by its imposition of the formal coherence that stories possess upon events that are represented as real, unquote. In various forms, this project tried to juxtapose or couple aspects which we normally associate with real ones with ones that we consider imaginary, and this will be the theme of much of my talk. Now, in 1982, rejecting the physical object as the endpoint of architecture was perhaps a more controversial position than it has become in the meantime. The discipline of architecture had not been subjected to deconstructive criticism, and terms like cyberspace or hypertext were simply unknown to architects. But even without today's terminology, the primary motivation behind the project was clear. Could developments in the technology of simulation be used to create an art historical meditation where the abstractions of critical discourse could be experienced hands-on, as it were? Could the experience of the virtual landscape be informed by painting, by the exploration of outer space, and I'm sort of referring to the kind of lunar quality of this image, by the collection of unbuilt or destroyed monuments of architecture, and by the articulation of the construction of space itself? Could there be a convergence of technology and criticism? Although I couldn't give it a name at the time, This project was the projection of my own desire to enter cyberspace. Both the figure in the image and the caption acts as invitations and allude to the complex relationship between the imaginary realm and the desiring subject. Now, the folly in architecture has been a traditional locus of escape. While this may seem as exactly the opposite of realism, as a desire for the imaginary rather than the real, its escapist function only works through its perverse discipline. The folly can only appeal to the world of reason. While this project sought to address the tradition of the folly as artifact in the picturesque landscape by putting Lissitzky's Lenin Tribune in a landscape by Poussin, its most distinguishing feature was its hope to place that experience in the new interactive world of computer simulation. What has most dramatically changed in the 10 intervening years has been the technological feasibility of this project. I first imagined producing a 20-second video loop that would illustrate the narrative of my text without any of the interaction that it described. I went to a computer graphics production house and described my project to them. They indicated that the production costs of a video would be about $10,000 per second of finished product, and that if I had about $200,000 to spend, we could talk. Well, as the cost of this project was coming out of my own pocket, I naturally demurred. And I was able to produce this one still image on a paint system by enrolling in a course at the New York Institute of Technology and shooting a slide directly from the monitor. Now today, of course, the video version of this project could be easily developed on a high-end personal computer. For a few $1,000s, one could have it commercially produced, but why bother? You could do it at home or at school. The interactive version would require a mid-sized workstation, and of course, one would be tempted to heighten the verisimilitude of the experience by using virtual reality interface, the gloves and glasses, rather than the monitor and joystick. Because of this extraordinary acceleration of technological development, we're increasingly tempted to appeal to the future to decide what to do. Strategic alliances with the future are desperately being sought, even though all we can really say about the future is that it cannot be predicted. And the sciences which appeal to us today, like the study of chaos or complex systems, serve to remind us and perhaps reconcile us to that fact. Our anxieties about the future have also become the stock in trade of various contemporary versions of the snake oil salesman, as I'm sure any of you who's tried to buy a computer recently can attest. Today, the proliferation of virtual worlds presses against our notions of reality in a much more urgent way than they did a few years ago. A number of previously stable distinctions between the natural and the artificial, for example, between science and storytelling, between what is alive and what is not, have become destabilized. We're willing to use expressions that would have previously seemed oxymoronic nonsense: virtual reality, artificial life, machinic phylum, desiring machines. This destabilization and the sense that technological change is a fact of life that we must face causes a number of anxieties today. The fear that cyberspace may force a radical redefinition and perhaps an impoverishment of architecture is just one of those anxieties. But before returning to this contemporary discomfort with the relations between the real and the virtual, I'd like to trace a certain lineage in architecture that we might find productive today. I have the next two slides, please. This lineage is the tradition of 20th century architect inventors like Pierre Charot, Oscar Nitschke, Buckminster Fuller, George Nelson, Eileen Gray, Frederick Kiesler, Jean Prouvé, Carlo Molino, all of whom were marginalized by the orthodox histories of modern architecture. Now, functionalism has become an object of critical ridicule for some time now, but these radical functionalists, to use a phrase formulated by Bruno Reichlin, sought to develop working methods that would maximize uncertainty in the outcome of their work. And this body of work was just as problematic to the protagonists of modern architecture as it was to their historians. The Corbusian synthesis of purest form with machine imagery carefully reassured us that we could choose between architecture and revolution. The modern automobile or airplane could still be compared to the Parthenon. Its radical and disruptive potential could still be tamed by its assimilation into the rational tradition of the West. The work of this other group can be characterized by an encounter between the human body and the machine, whose workings find an effective description in the desiring machines of Deleuze and Guattari, where machines are moments of productive coupling, and where the machine extends from assemblages of levers, gears, and sprocket wheels to the meeting of mouth and breast. In the 20th century, this liberatory technology of desire is in constant struggle with the normalizing technologies that assert themselves everywhere. But our understanding of what constitutes technologies has extended itself into the most intimate connections with our sense of self. In the Anti-Oedipus, first published in 1972, Deleuze and Guattari explored the links between psychic repression and social repression, seeking to recover the revolutionary quality of desire. For them, desire is not to be identified with lack, with the law, or with the signifier, but rather with production, with desiring production in the social field. For them, the Oedipal myth and its institutionalization in psychoanalysis stands directly in the way of understanding the productive unconscious. It's an obstacle to a materialist psychiatry which would introduce desire into the mechanism and production into desire. For them, desire produces reality. This machinic understanding of the self has an important pedigree in 20th century art and architecture, and I'd like to briefly take you through some of it. Could I have the next two slides, please? In his last paintings, such as The Bride of 1912 on the left, Marcel Duchamp elaborated an iconography that combined mechanical and visceral forms and began to move away from any procedures that revealed the artist's hand to create a retinal or anecdotal art, as he called it. The slide on the right is a drawing in 1913 entitled Bachelor Machine Elevation. And perhaps some of you working in such studios as Carl Trude's studio maybe find some resemblance to your work to this one. Duchamp first used the term bachelor machine around 1913 in connection with pieces of work that would later be assembled in the large glass of 1915-23. Can I have the next two slides, please? That piece is also known as The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors even. For Duchamp, and that, of course, the large glass is on the left, the term bachelor machine specifically refers to the lower portion of the glass, the realm of the bachelors, which contains, among other things, the chocolate grinder, the cemetery of uniform and liveries, priest, delivery man, gendarme, cuirassier, policeman, pallbearer, footman, station master, and page boy, and the témoin oculiste. Duchamp's work of this period can be seen as one step in his finely calibrated withdrawal from the prevailing practices of art, and the notion of celibacy, introduced through the bachelor machine, takes on a specific meaning in that context. The large glass consists of two distinct realms, the realm of the bride above and the realm of the bachelors below, both desiring and imagining one another without any possibility of mutual comprehension. I'm reminded a little bit of the imaginary real distinction or some of the current discussion of cyberspace. In 1954, Michel Carouge found a structural similarity between Duchamp's large glass and the punitive apparatus described in Franz Kafka's short story In the Penal Colony. That apparatus consists of a lower part, and this is a kind of a schematic reconstruction of it that appeared in the book. Of course, there was never any drawing specifically by Kafka or any drawing that really directly is tied to the short story. The apparatus consists of a lower part, the bed, an upper part, the designer, and a part that moves up and down and is called the harrow. The condemned man is strapped to the bed, and whatever commandment the prisoner has broken is written on his body by the harrow, which consists of a number of needles fixed in glass. The prisoner is not told of his sentence. He learns it on his body. This generally takes about 6 hours of suffering, after which the prisoner, in a moment of transfiguration, reads the inscription through his wounds and dies in the hours that follow. In Kafka's story, the machine, which had been invented by the former commandants of the colony, was programmed by elaborate and indecipherable drawings. Upon seeing one of those drawings, the explorer asked, did he combine everything in himself then? Was he soldier, judge, mechanic, chemist, and draftsman? At the end of the story, the officer in charge of the punishment, seeing that the system of the colony is breaking down, places himself in the machine and dies as the machine self-destructs. For Carouge, the similarities between these two machines resides first in the fact that they both operate as closed circuits, and second, as the action of one zone upon the other. In both of these machines, a message from the upper zone is inscribed upon the lower one. The fact that one is about sex, while the other is about death, underscores the importance of the modern myth of the Bachelor machine, a sort of new technological version of the mirror of Narcissus, in which is played out the interferences of machinism, of terror, of eroticism, of religion, and of anti-religion. The myth of the Bachelor machine is a kind of double articulation of difference, sexual difference and machinic difference. The erotic becomes the machinic in this specifically modern myth, which Baudelaire had already evoked in 1851 when he stated that, quote, "the act of making love greatly resembles torture or surgery," unquote. Lautréamont's celebrated chance encounter on a dissection table between an umbrella and a sewing machine is, of course, another instance of the myth of the Bachelor machine. Can I have the next two slides, please? The slide on the left shows the large glass in its first installation shot, and one does sometimes forget that it was a freestanding object and that its whole relation to the world was considerably different from the works that are shown on the wall. On the right is a slide of Pierre Charot's Maison de Verre, built between 1928 and 1932, which is a residence, a three-story residence inserted into an existing building, containing a gynecological office on the ground floor, living room above, and bathrooms and bedrooms on the top floor. In an analysis of the Maison de Verre by Pierre Charot, Kenneth Frampton pointed out the similarities between that building and the Bachelor machine, especially the large glass. An obvious similarity is the use of glass in the construction of a kind of hermetic world. But the Maison de Verre also supports analysis in terms of the closed cycles between the two realms, the realm of the bride and the realm of the bachelor. And I think that this strange image on the right with this sliding partition between the office and the waiting room indicates some of those kinds of strange tensions between these two worlds. Could I have the next two, please? Again, Charot's elaborate bathrooms, of course, justly celebrated as working out of this kind of eroticism of the machinery in relation to the body. But even these juxtapositions that you see in the living room between the metalwork which Charot developed and which the metalworker Louis d'Albert carried out, the juxtapositions of that metalwork with these kind of suave furnishings of the interior, which are also by Charot, serves to underscore this thematic of unlikely coupling. Could I have the next two, please? Now, this showing on the left is a chaise longue by Eileen Gray for 1920 for an apartment for Suzanne Talbot, and on the right, an alcove of the living room in the Villa E1027 that she designed in 1927 in collaboration with Jean Balovici. Now, most of the work that I'm showing has a clearly erotic character, and some of it a kind of gynecological aspect. Duchamp's work, for example, and the subject of Charot's commission. Some of it is also clearly voyeuristic, as we'll see in some of Molino's work and Kiesler's. But I don't think that we're concerned only with a male erotic. Eileen Gray, whose work is shown here, invested both the more traditional crafts of lacquerwork and woodwork, as well as the resolutely machinist bricolage of the villas, with an equally erotic charge. Contemporary feminists on science, such as Donna Haraway, have reminded us that the cyborg myth, which the Bachelor machine prefigures, is just as available to women as it is to men. It may also be useful to distinguish sex from gender here, and which may be getting me into rather complex ground, but certainly in the avant-garde of the 1920s and 30s, some indication of kind of gender bending as a concomitant to this erotic machinic imagery kind of went hand in hand. Could I have the next two? And could you pull those apart, Sally? Thank you. Now, for the surrealists, whose sexuality, it must be pointed out, was for the most part decidedly male, some of these internal tensions, which we've been describing in the Bachelor machines, was expressed as a simpler opposition between the body and the cage. This is Alberto Giacometti's Palace at 4 a.m. On the left, a project by George Nelson, the Maison Suspendue of 1936 to 1938. The Maison Suspendue is a close relative to the Maison de Verre, and in fact, this model was also fabricated by D'Albert with artworks by Calder, Léger, and Miraut. The curved profiles of the structure recall a work of Jean Prouvé, and Nelson's project was to contain one of Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion bathrooms, which the latter patented in 1937, and which started manufacture by the Phelps Dodge Company in the following year. Can I have the next two, please? On the left, slides of the Dymaxion bathroom, and again, not totally coincidentally, the fact that it can be it's sort of fabricated by men and assembled by women, and I think that there's still some strange combination of the two realms here going on. Fuller's subsequent investigations into the care and cleaning of the body included patenting a fog gun to clean the skin using compressed air and atomized water with triggered-in solvents. And here are some close-ups of analysis of the cells of the before, I believe. Can I have the next two slides, please? Now, if the bathroom became a kind of laboratory for the machinic transformation of the body, the other major point of coupling between the body and the machine was the articulation of vision. The techniques of the observer, which Jonathan Crary traces in his book by that name, became an effective machinic agency in the hands of architect inventors such as Carlo Molino or Friedrich Kiesler. On the left is a study for a vanity table for one of Molino's elaborately scenographic interiors from the late 30s and early 40s. And on the right, studies for the display and viewing of surrealist art by Friedrich Kiesler in connection with the Art of this Century gallery, which he designed for Peggy Guggenheim in 1942. Can I have the next two slides? On the right, further preparatory sketches of this, I suppose, sort of proto-disembodied couch potato or VR system, and on the left, a reconstruction that my partner Andy Zelenino and I did in 1988 at the Whitney Museum of the Art of this Century. Can I have the next two, please? At the hands of Carlo Molino, who's somewhat like Kafka's Commandant, held patterns for airplane and automobile design, designed furniture and interiors, was interested in the occult, and was a kind of universal fetishist, the machinist universe could be stripped bare by an intensely voyeuristic gaze. I do think it interesting to note the manipulation that he did on the nude on the left of so accentuating the curves that in fact I believe it starts partaking of a kind of bisexuality that perhaps you see in it. Can I have the next two, please? In their efforts to place new demands on reality by actively promoting the juncture of the real and the pure psychic automatism of the unconscious, the surrealists and architects influenced by them sought to integrate the instruments of vision, the work of art, and the environment. On the left is a gallery called the Blood Flames gallery by Friedrich Kiesler, and on the right a montage that he did showing Duchamp with kind of the tools and ideas that are kind of floating around in his work, suspended in space above him. Could I have the next two, please? One interesting comparison that can be made is between the ovoid operating room of George Nelson on the right for a hospital in Saint-Lô of 1954 and Buckminster Fuller's miniature Earth Observatory at Cornell University of 1952. The Earth is in fact a planetarium. It has the outlines of the continents made with mesh on the outside, and the observer climbs up into the middle of the globe. there's a minute level of error introduced by the fact that the observer is not at the center of the real globe, but rather on its surface. Yet when the observer looks straight up through the globe, he or she sees the star which is above Cornell at that time. If the person then looks through another part of the globe, for example through London, and sees another star, that is in fact the star which is directly in the zenith at London at that time. Fuller was always concerned that our experience of the Earth was completely inappropriate to what was really the case. For example, we see the sun and the moon rising in the sky when in fact the Earth is turning. From the center of this observatory, Fuller said, you began to see and feel the Earth to be revolving in the presence of the stars, in contrast to the everyday missensing of this phenomenon. Now, another form of being at the center of the universe would be to be in this operating table, blasted by these stars in the form of lights. Chances are, in this particular case, the subject, who is now at the center of an entirely different world, will be unconscious. But I think that to some extent, these are both attempts to reformulate the primitive belief or experience of believing that one is at the center of the universe. Can I have the next two, please? A little story about Kiesler was that his mother died when he was only a year old, and he was brought up by a large, warm-hearted Ukrainian nanny. One day as she was kneading dough, the 3-year-old Kiesler crawled under her wide skirt, lit a match, and discovered architecture. Now, this same impulse, I think, is operative. This is Kiesler on the left in the work that his project for the Endless House, or in this particular case, a sculpture called the Bucephalus Horse. And I suppose that the image of the right of Buckminster Fuller kind of emerging from the womb, or perhaps rather having a rather more kind of phallic persona, is capable of similar interpretations. Could I have the next two, please? These illustrations for an environment bubble accompanied a text by Rayner Banham entitled "A Home is Not a House," published in Meaning and Architecture, edited by Charles Jenks and George Baird. The illustrations are by François Delagré. Banham started this piece with the question, quote, when your house contains such a complex of pipings, flues, ducts, wires, lights, inlets, outlets, ovens, sinks, refuse disposers, hi-fi reverberators, antennae, conduits, freezers, heaters, when it contains so many services that the hardware could stand up by itself without any assistance from the house, why have a house to hold it up? He argued that if, quote, dirty old nature could be kept under the proper degree of control, the United States would be happy to dispense with architecture and buildings altogether. Using a phrase that he borrowed from Fuller, he imagined the home as a, quote, standard of living package, a transparent portable air dome floating just above the ground, a kind of unhouse that would fulfill the American dream of the good life in the clean countryside, PowerPoint homesteading, and a paradise garden of appliances. That's also a quote. While Banham emphasized the continuity of this idea with the American suburb, with the Jeffersonian ideal and even its embodiment in Philip Johnson's Glass House, the drawings by Delagré suggest a more dramatic withdrawal from society to a kind of media womb for post-industrial nomads. Can I have the next two, please? Now today, of course, the portable media environment no longer resembles a house at all, but rather an item of clothing, providing, as we see on the left, perhaps the ultimate in rose-colored glasses. And the word architecture, to quote the current issue of Newsweek, is, quote, a fancy term for a layer of software that helps the computer do its job, unquote. The Terminator, who is in many respects the ultimate Bachelor machine, saw red through his glasses, and a virtual architecture superimposed over his vision enabled him to target his prey or find handy expressions for dealing with the events of everyday life. It's, of course, no coincidence that the sunglasses on the left, due to be marketed this year, they have a television inside them, so resemble the Terminators. The cyborg fantasy is alive and well, and a broad spectrum of political thinkers, from feminists such as Donna Haraway to Arnold Conan the Republican Schwarzenegger, are grappling for its implications for humans. Could I have the next two, please? Here is a project for a highly androgynous vacuum cleaner by Hiroki Kazu at the Art Center of 1992. and on the left a 1-900 virtual number, which of course I'm sure will remind you of certain other current technological fascinations that are available to us. Now, one of the main purposes of this talk has been to point out that technology has already and perhaps always existed in the social field of desire. Its liberatory possibilities have always commingled with its potential for dominance and death. Like a fractal basin boundary, there is no clear dividing line between the two, yet the radical and transformative potential remains. A similar dynamic holds for complex interactions between the imaginary and the real, or between philosophy and technology. Can I have the next two, please? On the left is the opening shot from Blade Runner, and on the right a painting by Peter Alexander for a series called the Sky Cam Paintings, painted in 1992. Now, I believe that one cannot make simple distinctions between the real and the imaginary, as Christine Boyer does, for example, in a recent issue of Assemblage, where she asks, quote, "What does it mean for Los Angeles to be simultaneously offered as the visualization of cyberspace and promoted as the prototypical post-urban metropolis?" For Boyer, the danger of this formulation is that it may, quote, "undermine many of our postmodern architectural theories as they are applied to architecture in the city." Well, heaven forbid. But the dialogue between the real and the imaginary has found an enormous accelerator in cyberspace and a rich ambiguity in the phrase virtual reality. We increasingly inhabit a realm that moves almost imperceptibly from virtual to real, and it is becoming difficult to isolate issues that affect one but not the other. I believe that technological developments will continue to add layers of real virtuality and virtual reality to our experiences, and that these developments will fundamentally alter our distinctions between nature and artifice. Perhaps this excursion into the workings of some 20th century desiring machines can suggest directions in which architecture can engage in the production of new couplings of nature and artifice. Perhaps rather than architecture or revolution, why can't we have both? Thank you.
Well, I guess this is what you call a bifurcation point. Is there any way that I can get this sort of out of my face? Sorry. Thanks. Thanks. Well, somehow, after hearing Christian speak, I feel as though I took my my sort of assignment for this evening much too literally, which was to say something about the recent emergence of sort of an architectural interest in science and technology, and that's what I'm going to try to do. Although I feel that I feel that I sort of need to confess that I don't have anything very definitive to say about this. Instead, sort of here at the school and at this lecture series, for example, I feel rather that I'm watching something new, sort of begin to grow, and I'm not really sure how it will end up. If, therefore, the new relationship between architecture, science, and technology is a kind of emerging pattern of interest, it would actually be antipathetic to contemporary science to assume that one could predict its ultimate behavior and consequences. At the same time, however, and continuing along the same line of sort of quasi-metaphorical nonlinear dynamics, one could also argue that whatever happens will be sensitively dependent on its initial conditions of formation and will retain the memory of its formative patterns. So I would like to focus some attention on initial conditions, conditions that exist today and can be described without being either prescriptive or predictive. So very briefly, I'll just state what I feel can already be said about the coupling of science and architecture in their contemporary configuration. Above all, I think it reflects a renewed interest in the problematic and implications of form making, and an effort to think through how one might reconceptualize form making, such that it emerged from this period of reflection distinct from formalism in the modernist sense of the word. First, that was just sort of an observation, and this is how I would kind of try to turn it into an argument. I do think that the current interest in recent scientific developments on the part of some architects is significant rather than merely faddish, and contains the possibility of fairly substantive or at least interesting architectural change. Second, I think this emerging scientism is generated in part by a shift away from something else, that thing being philosophy. Not philosophy in general, but what one might call an impasse with regard specifically to form making that the relationship forged over the past 15 years between architecture and philosophy had led to. Third, the shift away from philosophy is, in my opinion, not merely a reactive and negative gesture, but is a positive shift towards something else, this thing being science. Again, not science in general, but those specific sciences and technologies that have recently transformed how they look at physical systems and which physical systems they look at, and that have increasingly engaged descriptive, visual, or plastic exploratory mechanisms in their analyses. Finally, while the end result of this dynamic interest is impossible to predict, some of its patterns of behavior are already apparent and describable. Now, with regard to my first observation, namely that the shift toward science is happening and is a potentially significant event, I suppose you only have to look at this lecture series or look around here at the school to see something is happening. SCI-Arc is obviously not the entire universe, but if you look at European shelter magazines, American academic journals, both the images and the texts are increasingly filled with ideas and the vocabulary of nonlinear dynamics and electronic multimedia. Can I have the first two slides? Hello? This is just sort of examples on the left. I'm sure everybody knows here Marcos Novak's, a project by Marcos Novak that was published in the cyberspace book, a kind of genetic algorithm composition, and Peter Eisenman's project for the Max Reinhardt House. Now, obviously, the percentage of the profession that finds its way into such publications is fairly limited. But were you to include firms that actually, say, use computer technology in their production, even if that technology is engaged more as a useful and functional rather than conceptual tool, that number would swell immensely. Moreover, while I do not believe that technology is a kind of out-of-control phenomenon that develops unassisted without human volition and that leads people by the prosthetic nose, so to speak, I also don't believe that it is simply an inert presence that has no unforeseen consequences. Frank Gehry and his office is actually a kind of good example of this migratory unpredictability. Can I have the next two, please? I guess it's now become sort of well known the use of extraordinary computer technology in the office, particularly aerospace technology and so forth. And I think, at least in my experience with the office, it really is often described as a super duper pencil. The discussion about technology in the Gehry office has specifically to do with the production of stone and the drawings for the production of stone that simply would not be possible without these techniques that allow these very irregular curvatures to be understood, that can, tell the quarry exactly how many irrational pieces of stone they have to cut, and so on and so forth. But although that's more or less as far as the story normally goes, can I have the next two? That really isn't the whole story. In other words, now, here obviously you see the Disney Concert Hall, and can I also have the next two? All of these computer images are in effect presentation drawings. In other words, they absolutely have nothing to do with the material production of the building. They're not quite what you might call conceptual tools, but they're obviously doing something more than acting as very elaborate pencils. Can I have the next two? A certain anxiety, but nevertheless interesting possibility, to me is also suggested by this particular image of the Lewis residence on the right, which I don't actually know if this is true or not, but somebody in the office told me, a young person working in the office told me that Gary said that they were not allowed to look at these images. So there's something frightening about these images to Gary. I'm not exactly sure what it is. He often says that they have a kind of overriding aesthetic. But what interests me, this is a kind of wire mesh drawing that you get when you use one of those scope things and trace around an actual physical model. This would be the representation that you get at the end. I'm very sort of intrigued by the kind of anxiety that Gary shows about this drawing in particular, because to me, more than anything, it looks like a Gary drawing. At any rate, now, so even in Gary's office at this moment, there obviously does exist a kind of distinction between a conceptual and functional interest in technology. I think that his office is also a good example of the fact that the two modalities are already engaged in a kind of feedback loop that may ultimately transform their circumstantial overlap into a more substantive commonality. But even leaving aside the question of how these interests and ideas might be transmitted, how they might migrate, so to speak, through the culture, one might still ask whether their diffusion is a good thing. One could, and I believe one must, ask whether we are witnessing the formation of a newly strong sort of urge to technophilia, encouraged by a huge industry devoted to the commodification of erotic desire through the manufacture of countless novelty items. I think that Christian's lecture suggested that that's not the only direction it has to go. One might also ask, is the fascination with VR simply the discovery of a new form of escapism, more fun than television, less worrisome than drugs, maybe? Is the interest in science, even those of complexity, simply a reassertion of the quest for truth and objectivity, offering the assurance of rational clarity in the face of mounting confusion? Does the renewed interest in an architecture of natural form merely indicate a greening of the architectural profession in the most vapid sense? I suppose all these questions add up to a kind of single question. Are we witnessing the formation of a resource-draining and distracting trend that at best will be like hula hoops, the archetypal fad, kind of forgotten, unwanted at the back of somebody's closet? Or, at worst, are we witnessing simply a kind of architectural adjustment to the various machinations of advanced capitalism? Now, like all new things, the interest in science and technology has the capacity to be used, abused, ignored, whatever. But at least to my mind, those kind of possibilities, so to speak, could be said in relation to just about anything, particularly anything new and familiar. And I don't think it necessarily says very much specifically about the convergence between architecture and science. Now, I have to say that part of my reason for doing this is probably because I'm a kind of architectural optimist. I just am going to focus on what I think is specific to this convergence and on what its productive potential might be. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think it's all that helpful to think about the recent emergence in architecture of an interest in science as an emergence out of nothing, or to suppose that it kind of happens in a cultural vacuum. Rather, I feel that some of its implications are best understood in relation to a shift away from something that, as I mentioned before, and risking gross oversimplification, one might identify as philosophy, or at least what architecture has called somewhat generically theory in recent years. This is, I guess, kind of a dumb little anecdote, but my own experience here at SCI-Arc a couple of years ago, I think the first time I did anything quasi-official, it was in the context of a course taught by a lot of people called Mapping the Territory. And the idea was to try to provide a kind of introduction to aspects of post-structuralist thinking. Now, I think with the variety of courses and vertical studios that are running around the school, the mapping is still going on, but it's now expanded, and the territory is not just post-structuralism, but the next millennium, science and technology. Now, on some level, part of what is facilitating this shift is the fact that the shift is not all that big. The literature on contemporary science and technology is filled with concepts and strategies unthinkable without some connection to post-structuralism, and some particularly continental philosophers, notably Deleuze and Virilio, are themselves clearly interested in the problematics of science and technology. There is, moreover, a growing body of literature devoted precisely to the convergences of these fields. I'm sort of happen to be thinking of Catherine Hales's book, Chaos Bound, Orderly Disorder in Contemporary Literature and Science, or George Landau's book, Hypertext, The Convergence of Contemporary Critical Theory and Technology, but there are many other examples. Now, while I think these convergences between humanistic critical thinking and contemporary developments in science raise an interesting set of issues, they are not quite the same issues that get raised when architecture is inserted into the loop. In the past decade, an enormous and enormously interesting body of literature has been produced devoted to the subject of the relationship between architecture and philosophy, a literature that was perhaps so interesting that it came to dominate much of the discourse in architecture. Now, the relationship between architecture and philosophy in general is not really my concern this evening. I would only point out that, as all of you know, the relationship is an ancient one, and it's not just old, but it's characterized by a rather particular kind of intimacy. Two factors that make it unlikely that the relationship will ever cease being important. However, I do think that the dominant position philosophy assumed in relation to architecture is beginning to weaken, and is doing so for particular reasons. One of those reasons might be called the thorny problem of metaphor, and the possibility that philosophy was more concerned with its own foundational metaphors that rely on architecture than with architecture itself, and that in fact for philosophy keeping this relationship metaphorical is of crucial importance. Somehow, however, these metaphors, like many philosophical dicta, assumed the role instead of doctrinal truths to which buildings simply either did or did not live up. In the worst cases, one heard again and again, in an almost liturgical rite, the accusation that the theory was not legible in the building. Over time, the possibility of asking how and if the buildings were legible in the theory became an increasingly inconceivable question, and architecture became almost a metaphor of its own metaphorical role in philosophy. Now, while I think for some, turning away from science is simply a kind of denial mechanism for avoiding the unsettling challenges posed by post-structuralism, this is to me, again, not the most interesting aspect of the phenomenon. Can I have the next two? Now, to try to suggest what I find a little bit more interesting, I want to tell a little story about Rem Koolhaas. This is the urban planning competition for Mélenchonard in France that he did in '87. Now, I'm sort of selecting Koolhaas. I could have selected others. I have some reasons to select him. One is because I think of him as an extremely thoughtful architect who is not prone to being reactive. Another is that this is just sort of one example of a certain phase that at least he claims he's sort of growing out of at this point, where he was interested in chaos and the sciences of complexity, but also because he did something that actually illustrates my point about the link between shifting away from a philosophically oriented discourse about architecture toward one concerned with science and technology. Now, at a conference given in New York last year, Koolhaas gave a talk, and his ultimate goal, or his ultimate subject, so to speak, was to talk about the need he sees for architecture to engage in a substantive way with technology, and with the need to develop a theoretical strategy for doing so in an appropriate way. He seemed sort of worried that there was a kind of inherent conservatism of the profession. He said, you know, Newton's apples are falling all over the place, but they're going to fall last for architects. Now, even though that was his point, somehow it seems that at least on a rhetorical level, he didn't want to start at that point. Instead, and I would add, earning his pedigree as the master of absolutely devastating one-liners, Koolhaas opened his lecture with the following quips about some rather famous and influential philosophers. He said, according to Derrida, we can't be whole. According to Baudrillard, we can't be real. And according to Virilio, we can't be there. Now, the dismissive venom implicit in such a reductive summary of a vast and complex body of ideas is remarkable. But his purpose, at least in my opinion, was not to evaluate post-structuralism itself. Rather, he was sort of acting out what he himself called the amateurishness of the intersection between architecture and philosophy. This performance led him, again, in sort of the next stage in his lecture, to recall a moment during the Anyone conference held at the Getty, which he clearly thought was sort of the amateur fest par excellence, when he was standing on the 7th floor of the Getty building in Santa Monica, and he was looking out the window, and he was standing with Frederick Jameson. And Jameson pointed out toward a structure that I think most of us here would probably consider a bleeding wound in the urban landscape and the blight of humanity, when Jameson turned to Koolhaas and said, "Now, isn't that a nice building?" Now, to my mind, Koolhaas's remarks suggest a kind of absolute exhaustion with an entire and immense body of architectural criticism that does not so much critique architecture as simply not much care about or really like architecture, and that does not, perhaps more importantly, reflect any substantive capacity to engage keenly and critically with architecture's material form. Although in the best cases, the lack of concern for the specificities of building has more to do with a political choice contesting the traditional importance attached to single buildings and their architects. In the worst cases, it has led to a totally unnecessary devaluation of built form itself. The resistance to the possibilities afforded by close analyses of material form and the proliferation of a monumental insensitivity to the implications of the visual field is not limited to architecture. Can I have the next? Again, I could sort of choose countless examples. This is a Kandinsky and a Mondrian. And I always feel somewhat pained when I look at these images or think of these artists who kind of struggled most of their lives to figure out ways to stop representing things, to try to construct things that aren't about the production of meaning and so forth. And there is this like thing happening in a lot of art historical circles where repacking the meanings, the specific iconography back into these paintings is like a quest after the Holy Grail. So now every little squiggle in a Kandinsky painting can now be shown to represent blah, 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 and Mondrian is not about balance, it's not about cosmic harmony and whatever, it's actually their direct representations of constellations of this stars or that star. Which I find a very extraordinary development. Now, I would, however, suggest that the historical presence of architectural metaphors in philosophy and architecture's more obvious relation to matters of political economy have made it particularly prone to this kind of visual insensitivity. Above all, however, my point is to suggest that the reemergence of science and technology, or their reconstrual as important parameters for thinking architecture, may not signal the death of the age of critical reflection, but rather the effort to redirect some of this critical reflection toward the specificity of architectural form, and an effort to think again about what kind of knowledge such form might construct. So if one of the initial conditions has to do with a shift away from philosophy because of the historically determined difficulty of having the architecture philosophy couplet engage with the dynamics of form and of form making, a next question it would be logical to ask is about the relationship specifically between science and form making. Now, in the broad span of the obviously millennial relationship between architecture, science, and technology, a relationship obviously that is as long and as intimate as the relationship between philosophy and architecture is. One can nevertheless point to the early 20th century as a moment when it was decided that the latter should somehow affect not just the idea of architecture and the visual arts, but the way they look and the forms they assumed. Some of the stuff that Christian showed would be a good example of that. But as a slightly different example of this sort of turn toward the visualization of science, I'm just going to refer for a moment to Guillaume Apollinaire, who claimed that cubism was specifically the visual analog of Einstein's special theory of relativity and of notions of the fourth dimension. Can I have the next two? Just as sort of an example. Now, my interest here lies not so much in Apollinaire's assertion itself, but in the kind of critical discourse it provoked. Leo Steinberg, a rather monumental figure in the history of art, argued in relation to this kind of thing, and I quote, that the art of the last half of the century may well be schooling our eyes to live at ease with the new concepts forced upon our credulity by scientific reasoning. What we may be witnessing is the gradual condensation of abstract ideas into images that fall within the range of sensory imagination. Now, arguing very much the reverse, in a book called Modern Art and Scientific Thought, Adkins Richardson claimed that all of these analogies between that have been claimed for establishing a rapport between Cubism and modern science, he said that they are as specious as they are ubiquitous. He asserted that Apollinaire used the term metaphorically and had as his principal concern the hope, and I quote again, of staking a claim to the absolutely monumental prestige of the principal scientific developments of the 20th century. Now, obviously, there are vast differences between these two accounts, but in fact, they share a common point of departure, and that is the notion that science thinks and art visualizes. Obviously, Steinberg and Richardson think that art visualizes better or worse, but nevertheless, that's more or less the structure. And that structure was probably most famously set up by Gideon in Space-Time and Architecture, who also used the relationship between science and Cubism to describe sort of contemporary developments, and particularly what he called the new representation of space. He argued, and I'm quoting again, "A stage has been reached where mathematicians deal with figures and dimensions that cannot be grasped by the imagination." So they have all of these ideas. Then the artists go, again, specifically into their scientific laboratories. He says this new representation of space was accomplished step by step, much as laboratory research gradually arrives at its conclusions through long experimentation. The results of this research, according to Gideon, was obviously what we know now, the presentation of objects from several points of view, which he then argued introduced a principle bound up intimately with modern life, the notion of simultaneity, and all of these things came together to produce what he called the beginnings of the contemporary image. Now, unlike either Steinberg or Richardson, Gideon was very careful to avoid the notion of illustration and of influence. In other words, he did not really quite want to suggest that science had ideas and then those ideas influenced or were illustrated in art. In fact, his own view of history and of modernity demanded the idea of the simultaneous but totally independent nature of the interest in space-time. For it was this simultaneity that proved for him the triumph of modernity and the presence of an underlying structure for that modernity. It was not just that there was this kind of underlying structure, but that this structure would be a kind, it would perform a kind of therapeutic task. You know, Gideon is famous for all of these splits, the split between thinking and feeling, for example, that he describes as being symptomatic of the 19th century. Here again, then, is the split between artists and scientists in the 20th century, all of a sudden, however, coming simultaneously and independently to form this contemporary image. So the purpose of this relationship between art and science for Gideon had to do specifically with the representation of modernity and with the desire to construct that representation such that the very schismatic and disjunctive conditions said to constitute the modern would be transformed into a coherent and thus therapeutic whole. Can I have the next? Obviously, the specifically scientific sort of strategies give way to generalized, much more generalized evocations of sort of modern life. Now, as I said, sort of crucial to this sort of quest for this unified coherence to modernity, Gideon relied on the idea that science devoted itself to ideal questions beyond the comprehensible, so to speak, beyond the human imagination, and that this ideal realm would finally be concretized through the work of art. Now, this idea of trying to find a kind of theoretical framework that works as a kind of antidote to the fragmentation of modernity obviously did not begin with Gideon, and it doesn't stop with Gideon. Just as an example, I will Henri Lefebvre, in his book The Production of Space, also emphasized the highly abstract and schismatic nature of certain branches of modern science and mathematics. He wrote, "They invented spaces, an indefinity of spaces, non-Euclidean spaces, curved spaces, x-dimensional spaces." His list goes on, but the relationship between mathematics and reality, physical or social reality, was not obvious, and indeed a deep rift had developed between these two realms. Now, obviously, this analysis differs from Gideon's, but it's like Gideon's in the sense that its final quest is for the reconstruction of a unitary theory of modern spatiality. Now, there are many things that make a return to Gideon's vision of the cooperation between science and art toward the production of a coherent and ideally guided modernism unlikely, and that make Lefebvre's goal for a unitary and unilateral theory equally difficult to imagine. First, it has become more or less impossible to assign to science the merit of accruing the kind of monumental prestige that Richardson assigned to him, since the unique capacity of science to produce objective truth and knowledge has obviously been increasingly undermined. After Thomas Kuhn's book on the structure of scientific revolutions, the heroic image of the scientist working as he was described by Gideon, innocently, purely, and selflessly in isolated laboratories seeking truth, has been transformed into the image of a kind of custodial service, where most scientists are in fact janitors mopping up the loose ends of the prevailing paradigm. The image of science as the revealer of truth and finder of knowledge has been replaced by a notion of science as the constructor of fiction and momentarily dominant paradigms based less on truth than on the usefulness of the metaphors they engage. Science as reason is mutating into science as creative unreason. As Kazuo Shinohara said in relation to a show of work that he had at New York recently called The New Machine Absorbing Chaos, he refers specifically to Gideon. Gideon analyzed the relationship between the theory of relativity and architectural concepts. In the same way, in 1991, modernism is integrating contemporary scientific theory, including chaos theory. The new rationalism that I endorse accepts chaos. Now, above all, various that make Gideon's proposal relatively untenable, various critiques of science have simply precluded the possibility of using scientific metaphors as a means of constructing unitary and universalizing modernities. Now, one of the most specific obstacles that lies in the path of reconstructing Gideon's utopian merger of science and art is the degree to which the sciences toward which architecture is currently gravitating are sciences that do not concern themselves only for the unimaginable in the sense that Gideon meant. From chaos and complexity to morphogenesis and topology, from biology and genetics to artificial life and robotics, all of these fields deal precisely with things that have shape and figure, that exist in space, and are subject to the directionality of time. May I have the next two? Again, I could use countless images. On the left is this kind of epigenetic landscape. Time here works essentially in the form of gravity, or on the right, one of Mandelbrot's fractal sets is sort of infinitely complex boundaries of things. Part of the point, though, is how incredibly important these visualizations are to the sciences in question. Now, it is not just that these sciences deal with form and with the complexities of form, but that they deal mostly with these complexities. One of the most common themes one runs across reading the literature of contemporary science is the distinction between explanation and description. Phenomena ranging from weather patterns to the development of life in artificial environments, so it is said, cannot be now or ever thoroughly theorized in the abstract or predicted in advance. In other words, they cannot be fully explained, but they can only be described through the processes of formation that occur in the meeting of matter and energy. May I have the next two? Again, this is another Mandelbrot fractal thing where this is one of these four magnets with a pendulum over the top of it. You can never tell exactly where the pendulum is going to rest. Not only can you not tell, were you to try to understand what it was doing, this is the kind of infinite complexity that you would understand and that you would end up discovering. And in fact, on a kind of video camera where you can indefinitely enter into these images and watch each boundary contain a boundary within it, contain a boundary within it, and so forth, is probably the most effective way to describe the principle, perhaps not wholly explain it. This one is sort of phases in the self-assembly of a virus. Once again, the kind of thing that actually Novak was doing at the beginning. Here you sort of put elements into the virtual environment, watch what happens without ever actually knowing at the end. So without this kind of ability to see what's happening, in fact, you wouldn't really have very much to say. To my mind, all of these kinds of things indicate that the radical distinction between an idea and the form that it lives in, that was very important to Gideon, between principle and performance is no longer operative. And one result is the idea that defining art is that which gives visual and material form to the conceptual and immaterial is no longer tenable. If one of the possibilities then afforded by the recent convergence of architecture and science is a reconceptualization of the very specificities of formation rather than design, then the potential collapse of certain usually held to be categorical distinctions is not necessarily a thing of the future, but a possible direction indicated already today. May I have the next? For example, constructing philosophy as the knowing and seeing eye and relegating the building to the natural terrain of the ground, which is to be seen and to be known, is of course a relationship of verticality and horizontality that has both geometry and gender. Thus, if the structuring of gender is part of what has helped maintain this disciplinary structure, one might ask what are some of the gender implications in the shift toward science and technology? Fields obviously thought to be typically masculine domains, if not downright dens. Several obvious examples come to mind, like the figuring of natural systems as female deities like Gaia or Chaos. But perhaps more interesting, and may I have the next, is the transformation of design and the design process into ideas of morphogenesis and breeding. May I have the next? Here, these are again self-reproducing loops, genetic algorithms that kind of spawn, so to speak. And you aren't really sure what you're going to get when you start. Now, there are obvious similarities here to the effort of the surrealists and the situationists to incorporate chance and nonsense into the creative process. But it also, particularly when seen in the light of the general interest in biological sciences as opposed to mathematics, seems to suggest a shift from male modes of production to female modes of reproduction. May I have the next? Some of these probably get to the point where the gender is a little bit more difficult to identify. Here on your right, this is again a kind of computer-generated biomorph where the designer kind of plays genetic engineer a little bit, sort of saying, I like it, kind of go this way without really knowing what's happening. On the left, I guess I just had to show it, it's everybody's favorite critter, the slime mold, which is one of these extraordinary creatures that starts off as a kind of sort of a group of unicellular animals. They're all exactly the same. All of a sudden, under certain conditions, they kind of come together and form a clump. So they are able literally to transform themselves that far, but that's not it. Then they continue to develop, and they actually differentiate into parts so that there's a head and there's reproductive organs and there's feet and all kinds of things, although they all started from exactly the same physical material, and there would be no way to tell in advance which little critter was going to turn into a head and which little critter was going to turn into a foot. Now, I think one also sees in some of these kinds of ideas a desire to avoid the all-seeing eye implicit in universalizing theories in favor of local observations. One sees a shift toward metaphors of horizontal and network thinking rather than vertical and singular thinking, although I think that sometimes there's a kind of celebration of the reversal of top-down thinking to bottom-up thinking, which to me suggests more simply a shift in direction than actually a shift away from linearity. Nevertheless, and although I'm not suggesting that these developments indicate the final word on questions of gender, it does seem to me that a transfiguration of gender distinctions is possible now in a way that perhaps it had not been before. Another reconceptualization, may I have the next slides, that seems to be currently in process, so to speak, seems to me to be the development of a different kind of architectural historicity, one no longer based on the meta-narratives of dominant cultures, but a historicity based on the capacity of a system to retain the memory of its own formation. I like this image, this sort of schematic diagram. in this chapter called The Influence of the Past. I don't want to go into the details, but nevertheless, it attempts to indicate how through morphic resonance, the forms of past systems become present to subsequent similar systems. And this can take place over small or large distances, over small or large units of time. Now, if worked out in its fullest sense, these are just sort of the beginnings of ideas, I think, which may or may not happen. The idea of transforming the very nature of historical identity of architecture seems to me very fascinating. And in part, for my own reasons, part of what I find fascinating about it is that it would almost necessarily lead to a shift in position regarding the assigning to art and architecture the conventional role of fixing meaning. It has always had that role through historical association. Now, if we're lucky, I think, rather than fixing meaning, we may come to think about plastic form in ways that have more to do with the jobs it performs and information it produces than in terms of the meanings it monumentalizes and memorializes. This shift toward the temporarily performative rather than the eternally significant leads me to more or less my final observation on this subject, which concerns, perhaps surprisingly in the context of what was supposed to be a kind of futuristic lecture series, to the classical and ancient idea of mimesis, one of the obviously most enduring strategies that has been used to make plastic form in the visual field stabilize meaning. Now, on the one hand, obviously, it is simply the interest in natural phenomena in general, however newly conceived, that brings me back to this ancient idea of mimesis. But there's a specific aspect of mimesis that I'm kind of interested in, and that is that architecture's role or relationship to the tradition of mimesis has traditionally been in the context of analogic mimesis. Excuse me, can I have the next two? Nature has obviously been defined in a million different ways, weird cosmic laws of harmony and so forth on the left. This is a medieval sketchbook, a drawing from a medieval sketchbook. On the right, John Ruskin. Can I have the next? All kinds of relationships to the human body and so forth. But pretty much the most consistent factor in all of this is that architecture has sought to cause these various natures in their many undisguises, not so much through direct illustration or representation, but by abstracting them into principles which can then be internalized and reproduced analogically as meaning. For many, ironically, it is precisely the relative ease with which some of these new views of science can be perceived that is problematic. Unlike the fourth dimension or the special theory of relativity, chaotic attractors and fractal geometry, as I said, are very easy to visualize, much easier to visualize than they are easy to explain. So this has led to concern voiced by a lot of people, Rem Koolhaas in particular, that one might be moving toward a kind of simple representation or illustration of natural processes or scientific concepts, and that in the end, I suppose the point is, can I have the next? 2 slides, that there probably isn't a good answer to the question, what is the purpose of a building in the shape of a butterfly attractor? It might mean something, but it probably wouldn't be very useful, not in functional terms. Now, in my mind, it's perhaps not the mimetic principle that is proving inadequate in this context, but the structuring of that principle according to analogy. The benefit, I think, of retaining some concept of mimesis is its capacity to reinforce and insist on some connection between the formal system in the process of emerging and something outside the system. Mimesis in this sense would help assure openness to any particular system and guard against closure and autonomy, precisely the shortcomings that we associate with the formalisms of earlier in the century. Now, moving away from the concept of analogy, however, would also provide a benefit in addition. In other words, I'm arguing sort of trying to hang on to the idea of mimesis in some way because it provides an opportunity for the openness of the system. I'm trying to suggest moving away to conceptualizing the relationship to the mimetic tradition in terms of analogy. Because for me, the basic problem with the idea of analogy is that the thing itself becomes only a virtual version of a different and more real phenomenon. May I have just the left slide? I mean, this long history of how you go from the real to the representational to the analogy and finally to architecture is in some kind of way easily encapsulated here by this drawing called The Invention of Drawing, done in 1830, but by an architect, Schinkel. Now, were one to borrow ideas from artificial life and artificial environments, one might argue instead that the parts out of which something might be made, let's say a genetic algorithm or an architectural drawing, might be virtual. But the animate behavior they produce is not analogically like something else necessarily, but can actually be understood as the thing itself. Perhaps one should think, therefore, of substituting analogic mimesis with something that we might very metaphorically call digital mimesis. This is not an idea based on the simulation or representation of computer images, but an attitude toward the production of form that would consider each of its parts not in permanent and truthful relation one to the other, but as momentary stops or caesuras in an endless flow of possibilities. Can I have the slide on the right? One reason for getting away, even farther away from the problem of analogy is that obviously you don't even have to go as far as VR and cyberspace to start getting lost between what is the real and what is the not real. This is from William Mitchell's book, The Reconfigured Eye, which he calls a counterfactual photograph. Obviously it's a doctored photograph that answers the question, what would have happened had Groucho and Rambo been at Yalta? Now, because in digital information processing, each pixel is either on or off, they must be conceived as horizontally and non-hierarchically connected, no one more original or more central to the other, but each equally productive in a process that creates a fictitious whole. Now, as I said at the beginning, I've just tried to sort of sketch out some of the directions that we may or may not take, but I think that one can begin to sort of sense today. And to me, the main point of all of this is that there is this interest, in my opinion, not in formalism, but in matter and its shaping. Whether one is speaking about morphogenesis, genetic algorithms, digital image processing, and so forth, they all share one common feature, namely the insistence on the seamless simultaneity between the articulation of the principle of formation and the act of formation itself. That kind of simultaneity, in my opinion, may well encourage the consideration of urban buildings, not in the sense of a kind of empty or formalist contextualism, but more in terms of overall patterns of behavior occurring within dynamic areas of flow. It may well help unbind the relationship between designing and knowing toward designing and discovery, permitting a dizzying combination of fanatic rationality and liberating irrationality, which is, I think, how I would describe some of the work in Carl Chu's studio. Perhaps this could lead to buildings that think of themselves less as sort of scientific metaphors or as machines for living in. Can I have the slide on the left? And might start thinking of themselves as living machines. May I have the slide on the right? I think that the relationship between the cage and the body and a new kind of relationship is very clear here between this image of Koolhaas's Bibliothèque Nationale and some of the things that Christian was talking about. And again, that might think of buildings that don't so much reflect intelligence, but that actually are themselves intelligent. One thing I think is for sure already, and that many of these developments demand a new form of architectural criticism that pays attention, which I think would not be a bad thing for either architecture or criticism. Can I have the last two? Now, again, this is again, one could continue on this discussion about the relationship between photographs and cyberspace and so forth, between the real and the not real, all kinds of issues that have been brought up. But on the left is Gordon Matta Clark's project called Splitting, and on the right is a project that I'm sure you'll all see when Hani Rashid comes and speaks here, called Hyperfine Splitting. Now, where all of this may lead is anyone's guess. What exactly one would make of this comparison, I think, is open for discussion. But I do think that many of these issues are potentially useful, even if only insofar as they, to use a very increasingly banal metaphor, encourage us to flap our little butterfly wings in the hope of instigating a change in attitude toward architecture. This change might move away from the production of meaningful form toward an idea of architecture as a means of activating matter and harnessing the various process of formation. It might move away from unitary and unilateral theories of modernity to all of the complex forms of contemporary convergences. That, I think, might be a good thing. Thank you. We just thought it would be less stuffy to have questions sort of outside. So